Thank you to our readers. I have to say, I'm already feeling this before we even started discussing it with you. Those were poignant passages that were read well. So it's been 6 months now that we have been reading through the story of the Bible together. And as Frank and others mentioned, we read about one of the most defining events in that story last week, the fall of Jerusalem. Now, it's hard to overstate just how important Jerusalem was to the Bible story. It was the capital city of the land that God had been promising the chosen people all the way back since Genesis chapter 12, when God promised to take Abraham and Sarah into a land. It's also the city that the most iconic king in Israel's history, David himself, founded and established, which was supposed to be the place from which his descendants would reign forever. And most importantly, it was the city that housed the temple of Yahweh, the holiest site in the entire Jewish faith, which continues, in fact, to be the holiest site of the Jewish faith to this day. And so Jerusalem was extraordinarily important. And it's not as though it had had an uncheckered history. It had experienced highs and lows before, a number of close calls, especially when it looks like the Assyrian Empire, which had surrounded and besieged the city, was going to destroy it till God spared them miraculously. But then when we get to the end of this narrative that runs from Judges all the way to 2 Kings, in 2 Kings chapter 25, the Babylonians finally do it. They destroy Jerusalem. And as Frank said, it's not just destruction. We're talking total annihilation. They took the vast majority of the population that survived the attack and deported them to different cities and towns all around the Babylonian Empire so that they could no longer be connected to their land. They removed and killed the last reigning descendants from the throne of David, putting a Babylonian ruler there instead. And they utterly destroyed the temple. They systematically got rid of its holy objects. They burnt it to the ground so that the people could no longer turn to their God as a source of hope or help. And this, as we discussed, changed everything. I mean, it was such a fundamental shaking up of the way that people thought about God and what it meant to be a part of God's people and their promises with God, that the prophets had to come up with some new ways of understanding God, ways of understanding what it means to be God's people in a world that is dominated by empires, which is still the question that God's people have to wrestle with today. And so last week we talked about that history, we talked about some of those theological issues, and you would think that perhaps now it's time to move on. But my impression from reading the scriptures is that it doesn't want us to. The scriptures beckon us to sit with this story a little bit longer. Not just to think about it as an influential event, a significant part of history, but to really imagine what it was like to be in the shoes of the people who went through it, to feel their pain, and to allow that pain to shape the way that we understand and relate to God. I say the scriptures beckon us because there are a number of scriptures that do nothing except for reflect poetically or ask questions or give space for the pain of the people who went through here. In fact, there's an entire book of the Bible, the book of Lamentations, whose sole purpose is to express the pain that people experience as a result of this destruction. So as uncomfortable with it as that is, I think we need to spend a time engaging these perspectives this morning. And I want to be looking at three perspectives in particular. We're going to be considering the Book of Lamentations. And although Christian tradition has often attributed it to Jeremiah, it is technically an anonymous book. And so, just to be safe, we'll refer to the author as the lamenter in this series. And the primary way that the lamenter responded to this was through the expression of sadness. And when I'm talking about sadness, I don't just mean your ordinary disappointment or having had a hard day. I'm talking about that extreme, crippling sadness that makes it hard to get up in the morning or see any color in the world around you at all. A sadness that we would call depression in modern times. Consider this passage from Lamentations chapter 3 that I think captures it pretty well. My soul is bereft of peace. I've forgotten what happiness is. So I say, gone is my glory and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. This experience of hopelessness is not unique to the writer of Lamentations. And I think there's value in taking some time listening to it and engaging this way of responding to tragedy. We'll also be considering the words of the psalmist who wrote Psalm 137. Now, oftentimes we associate the Psalms with King David, and indeed some of the Psalms are attributed directly to David himself. But the truth is that they are a large collection that spans a long period of time in Israel's history. And this particular psalm was written by one of the Jews who had been exiled to Babylon. And this is a psalm that expresses sadness, yes, but also anger, a fierce and bitter and vengeful anger toward the people who had committed such atrocities against the Jews. And although this is a little uncomfortable for us to read, especially as Mennonite Christians who put so much emphasis on peace and forgiveness, it is a part of our biblical canon. And it is a real part of people's responses and experiences with tragedy. So I want to take some time to engage that too. And then finally, we're also going to be listening to the prophet Habakkuk, a prophet who not only experienced the sadness from the events and anger at the people who had committed them, but also, to be honest, anger against God, bewilderment against why God would allow this to happen, and admittedly, doubt at God's ability to fulfill his promises, to bring the justice that's proclaimed throughout the rest of the Bible. Habakkuk, I think, offers a constructive way to engage those feelings of doubt and confusion. And so we want to make some space too for his voice. Now, I want to warn you that as we are interacting with these perspectives of people who have undergone an extraordinarily traumatic experience, we are going to be reading and engaging references to violence, to sexual violence, to violence against children, things that for some of us might be triggering and difficult to hear. And so I want to encourage you to know that you have the freedom to step away. If it gets overwhelming, you can always mute me and I won't know any better about it, or you can take a break and listen to it later on through our website or our podcast or YouTube channel. But I do think it's important that we engage with these things because as ugly and difficult as they are, they're a part both of the story in our Bibles and they are a real representation. And, I want to note that we're not just listening to these perspectives in order to be empathetic, but there's something that all of us have to learn from them, especially if we believe this famous claim from 2 Timothy chapter 3, which says that all scripture is God-breathed and is useful for teaching, for reproof, for correction, and training in righteousness. And so I want to be asking the question, what can we learn? Can we gain? Can we grow from these passages that even spend so much time in hopelessness and pain and despair? So let's brace ourselves to get through what might be a difficult sermon in order to face the reality of pain and tragedy and suffering, starting with the book of Lamentations. Now, the author of Lamentations, the lamenter, as I've mentioned, was a person who was one of those few individuals who had not been deported to one of the different cities or towns around the Babylonian world. Instead, this person was left behind, left in the ruins. And we already knew that there were some people who had this experience, even though the vast majority of Jerusalem had been deported. After all, we read this line in 2 Kings chapter 25 that says, "But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest people of the land to be vine dressers and tillers of the soil." So we know that some people are there, but outside of that, the narrative doesn't really give us anything about their experience. We just know that they exist. And the book of Lamentations is sure to help us fill that gap. It immerses us in the perspective of the people who were left behind, as it were, beginning with the opening verse that says, "How lonely sits the city that was once full of people. How like a widow she has become, she that was great among the nations." Now, I can't speak to what it was like to live in any of these experiences, but I have to say, if I had to choose between being a person who was left behind in Israel or deported somewhere else, I'd probably choose to be deported because it would just be too painful to have to live with the constant memory that the city is not what it was, that the emptiness of it was what reigned, that the people there no longer knew about the traditions that had existed. I have to imagine that this was particularly painful around the period of time of the holidays, when you would normally see the city bustling with energy and people gathering. But instead, we hear the lamenter tell us that the roads to Zion mourn, for no one comes to her festivals. All her gates are desolate. Her lot is bitter. So this was a painful reality to constantly see that the friends, the family, the tradition, the memories were gone. But unfortunately, this was the least of the challenges that the people who lived there had to go through. In addition to dealing with this grief, they had to deal with the fact that they were now vulnerable with nobody protecting them. Because the soldiers who now lived in the area and the exiles from the other parts of the Babylonian world who had been brought in to fill that space often took advantage of their powerful position in order to force people out of the property that they had held in their family for generations. So, for example, the text tells us that our inheritance has been turned over to strangers, our homes to aliens. We must pay for the water we drink. The food we get must be bought. Now, keep in mind that these homes weren't just this symbolic, meaningful place where they lived, but it was also their source of, uh, of sustenance. It was where they got their food. It was where they got their wood for building homes. It was where they were able to remain alive and safe. And when these things were taken away from them, they were all of a sudden in a very dangerous position. They had to barter for everything they owned. There are references that indicate that there was hyperinflation going on. They had to venture into areas where there was animosity towards them, where they weren't safe. And in fact, at one point toward the end of the book, it goes on and expresses not only these challenges, but it begins to catalog a number of crimes that were committed against them when they were in this position. So it says, women are raped in Zion, virgins in the towns of Judah. Princes are hung up by their hands. No respect is shown to the elders. Young men are compelled to grind, and boys stagger under loads of wood. These are descriptions of sexual violence, of forced labor, of cruelty and intentional humiliation. It's not fun to read. So, what's this supposed to offer us? This book that just expresses so much of a grim view of the people who found themselves in this situation. Is it in order to set us up for the hopeful response? Well, I will acknowledge that there are verses that express hope in Lamentations. It's not all despair. There's a little bit of a back and forth between these hopeful moments, including some of the lines that function in some of my favorite Christian songs and hymns, such as the reminder that God's promises are new every morning and that great is God's faithfulness. But I do not think that the point of Lamentations is to offer a happy spin on these difficult things they were going through. In fact, the very last verse, although it acknowledges that God is eternal and that the possibility of redemption awaits, leaves us with the question, the possibility that maybe God had gotten so angry with Judah that there was never going to be relief from this degree of suffering. So I don't think that its point is just to offer these hopeful answers to these challenges, but there is a sense in which Lamentations seeks to be, it's in a somewhat unfamiliar way for most of us. But I want to call attention in particular to this line from Lamentations chapter 2. It says, "What can I say for you? To what compare you, O daughter Jerusalem? To what can I liken you that I may comfort you, O virgin daughter Zion?" It seems to be that the lamenter was struggling to try to find a way to capture, to describe the pain that the people were experiencing. Because the truth is that for some people, this is meaningful. To be able to understand that pain, to be able to put it into words, to be able to narrate it in a way that expresses the internal turmoil within them that other people can hear and understand. I honestly think that many of us should begin to think about comforting more in these terms. Oftentimes, when people go through tragedy, and our response is to tell them, well, everything is going to be okay, or this is God's solution, or you don't need to worry, that ends up invalidating what they've experienced. And a more helpful response might be to try instead to validate it, to capture it, to acknowledge how severe and vast the pain is, to help them articulate it in a narrative that makes sense. Now, this isn't true for everybody. There's no one size all solution to grief, as our different perspectives, our different responses to grief reveal. But even for people who don't find it particularly comforting to have their pain reflected in this way and who would prefer to have the reassuring words, I think at some point, sooner or later, we all have to be willing to engage our pain if we want to heal. This is true not only at the individual level, but at the corporate level as well. When the nation of South Africa experienced a horrific experience of racism through a system called apartheid, was finally working toward healing and reconciliation, its Truth and Reconciliation Commission realized that in order for that healing to occur, the crimes and the harms and the atrocities that the oppressors had committed against the victims had to be acknowledged and named, cataloged by both sides. Now, this isn't fun for anybody. Nobody wants to be seen as an oppressor. Nobody wants to be seen as a victim. This is a difficult process. But being able to acknowledge and name the truth of suffering and tragedy is an essential. And I think that the book of Lamentations does a good job of acknowledging that, finding that there is healing and value simply in naming and expressing the pain that people experience. Now, I want to consider next the perspective of the psalmist who wrote 137. And unlike the lamenter who's writing from Jerusalem among the people who'd been left behind. The psalmist was one of the people who had been exiled, specifically to the city of Babylon, and was trying to rebuild a life there. We know this because it's stated in the opening line. It says, "By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion." Now, here we find a number of similarities despite the different locations. The people who were still in Jerusalem and the people who had been deported were now in socially vulnerable positions. They experienced similar tragedies. They were both dealing with grief. But there was a significant difference in the context. Now, the people who were in Babylon had to come face to face with their direct persecutors, the capital of the nation of the people who had attacked them and subjected them to this. And apparently, the local citizens were goading the Jewish exiles by pressuring them to share some of their songs, their history, their culture, in order to entertain them. Now, we don't know if this was done with a spirit of cruelty in order to mock them, or maybe they were just trying to kind of be chummy and say, "Hey, well, you're here now, let's be friends." But either way, it was extraordinarily insensitive to the pain that the people had experienced. As the psalmist responds, "For there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked us for mirth, saying, 'Sing us one of the songs of Zion.'" And they found this just to be enraging. This is just an infuriating experience. And so, in response, the psalmist finishes the text with a prayer to God, a prayer that is unusually violent and which has the reputation of being one of the worst or cruelest verses in the Bible. It says this: "Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they said to it, 'Tear it down, down to its foundations.' O daughter Babylon, you devastator, happy shall be they who pay you back what you have done to us. Happy shall they be who take your little ones and dash them against the rock." Now, this is a shocking, very disturbing image of violence committed not just against enemies, but against their children, their young ones, their babies, in fact. And it's understandable that many of us would hear something like this and say, "This can't be Holy Scripture," right? Like this does not fit with what we believe about God. God told us to forgive our enemies. And even if we set that aside, cruelty against children cannot be tolerated. But before we rush to judgment here, let's take a moment to try to consider where this anger is coming from and what it means, which, by the way, are generally the best ways to respond to anger. Instead of just reacting to it, we should try to think about why people are saying the things that they're saying, what's going on, what they're hoping to get out of them. I think we actually, you have this horrific image at the end, and you think, where in the world would they even come up with this cruel image of vengeance? But I think we actually have the answer to that in the previous verse. It says, "Happy shall be they who pay you back what you have done to us." Now, my guess is that this image of hurting children wasn't just drawn from thin air, but it was a part of what happened when the Babylonians finally breached the city of Jerusalem and began cruelly attacking the people. Imagine that there was a lot of violent imagery, indiscriminate killing, including the killing of children. And the people who lived through that had to carry that pain. They were carrying that pain when these Babylonian citizens were now saying, "Hey, let's get along here. Why don't you tell us one of the songs, from your time back when you lived in Zion?" That should be interesting for us to hear, knowing that these were the people who were responsible for the killing of their children. But they were in such a vulnerable position that they couldn't even name this pain. I mean, they didn't have any rights in the city of Babylon. They couldn't afford to offend the people. And so they couldn't express, hey, I don't want to hear that from you. You hurt us. Instead, they had to turn it to God. They say, God, I just wish that they could experience the pain that we experienced. I wish that somebody would do to them these violent things that they had done to us. Now, still, this isn't the gospel when Jesus says to love and forgive our enemies. But I don't think that this is necessarily a violent act either. Because it's not a text that is calling on people to take up arms, to take revenge, to find a way to attack these Babylonian folks. Instead, it does precisely the opposite. It turns the pain and the rage and the feelings of vengeance over to God, allowing God to be the one who responds instead of them. And I think a passage like this can help us understand why a book like Obadiah is so important. Now, Obadiah is a very short book in the Older Testament, and its whole focus is to call for vengeance on Edom. And so that doesn't sound like a particularly constructive book for many of us who read it and think, what are we supposed to gain out of this? You might be wondering, why are we even talking about Edom? The Babylonians were the ones who attacked the people of Jerusalem. And that's true. The Babylonians were the primary oppressors in this story. But the kingdom of Edom had been this nation that lived right next to the kingdom of Judah, and that it had had a back and forth power struggle with Judah for centuries. They often ran into conflicts. There were many times out on top, and it demanded that the people of Edom pay tribute to them. But there were also a number of deep ethnic ties between the two people. In fact, the tradition says that the Edomites were descended from Esau, just as the people of Judah were descended from their brother Jacob. So this just suggests that they were ethnically and culturally similar. Maybe the people of Edom even practiced circumcision. They were theoretically descendants of Abraham, after all. And yet, when the Babylonians came through and committed these horrific acts against Judah, the Edomites found a way to benefit from that. Not only did they not support the people of Judah, but when some of those from Jerusalem were trying to flee and escape and get away, they would capture these slaves and bring them back to the Babylonians in the hopes of getting some reward for that. After the Babylonian looting finally ended, some of the people of Edom decided, hey, maybe we can run through the town now that they're weak and powerless, and we can profit from this as well. And generally speaking, there was this spirit of, you've been cruel to us all these centuries. We're going to laugh at you now in this context. And the Jews were powerless to do anything in response to these claims. But Obadiah, a book that to us might not seem to have much value, is exactly the words that the people who experience this kind of suffering needed to hear. And Obadiah says, you should not have looted Israel's goods on the day of his calamity. You should not have stood at the crossings to cut off his fugitives. You should not have handed over his survivors on the day of distress. For the day of the Lord is near against all nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head. Here, God is assuring the people of Judah that, yes, I have heard your complaints, and you're right. These people have wronged you. And in fact, they are not going to get away with it. They are going to experience the consequences of their actions. But you'll notice that when God responds, it's in a much more measured way than maybe violent hopes that the people have. But it offers what they need to hear, the knowledge that God hears them and that justice will be done, which gives them the freedom to be able to let some of that pain and vengeance go. And finally, I want to look briefly at the prophet Habakkuk. A prophet who's somewhat unique because he spends just as much time talking to God as he spends talking for God on behalf of the people. Now, we don't know where exactly Habakkuk was writing from. In fact, we know very little about him at all, except that he was reacting in response to the same set of events that so many other people were reacting to. But in addition to expressing the sadness of Lamentations and the anger of Psalm 130, Habakkuk also has anger and frustration with God, as we can see from these opening words. "O Lord, how long shall I cry for help, and you will not listen? Or cry to you violence, and you will not save? The law becomes slack, and justice never prevails. The wicked surround the righteous, therefore justice comes forth perverted." Now, this is an expression of doubt, even a complaint or a critique that God is not doing things well, that it doesn't make sense in light with God's own principles of justice. Now, in our times, when we hear or read something like this, which is common, people often point to tragedies as a sign of God's failure. It's usually perceived as a lack of faith or an attack on faith. That people say, you know what, if your God was real, then God would never allow these kinds of horrific things to happen. And so this just disproves it. It's all worthless. But that's not what's happening here in Habakkuk. Habakkuk is addressing these complaints to God, bringing them up without necessarily breaking faith. And I would go a step further and argue that when the biblical authors do this, it's not seen as a rejection of faith, but rather an act of profound faith. Because it has the courage to be able to acknowledge that what's happening is not right, that it does not fit with what we know about God, while still holding on to the belief that God is good and true. And instead of having to resolve this with some kind of a superficial explanation that, well, maybe this all, kind of works out in God's plan, and we can see that this happened because of this, it's willing to sit in that uncomfortable tension and wait for God to respond. Habakkuk articulates this powerfully at the beginning of chapter 2, when he says, "I will stand at my watch post and station myself on the rampart. I will keep watch to see what God will say to answer me, and what he will answer concerning my complaint." Habakkuk was willing to sit in the space of not having an answer, which, as it turns out, is the place that all of us need to be able to sit in order to learn something new. If we keep rushing with our already prepackaged ideas and explanations, then God can't actually offer a new, real, powerful word for us. And so Habakkuk and many of the other people were willing to just name their pain and wait. Now, I think that collectively, these responses do offer a kind of way for us to engage in tragedy and grief. It's one that calls on us not just to rush through pain or to rush to answers and explanation, but to sit with it a little longer, to sit with the sadness, to sit with the doubt, to give voice to our confusion, voice to our pain, voice even to those deep hidden feelings of anger and vengeance that we have. But it's not because we want to sit here forever. We don't want to get comfortable in this space of wallowing in pity. It's with a posture of waiting and hoping and listening that maybe, just maybe, God has something new to say. And as we reflect on this lowest of lows in the whole story of the Old Testament and perhaps reflect on the low points in history that we're experiencing, or maybe even our own lives. Let's not give up on hope or belief or faith, but let's have the patience to sit and wait, even when we don't have the answers or know what it might look like.